Good evening, my little creeps and freaks. It is I, your old pal, the Collector. And welcome to yet another Friday Night Fable Fright. Now, I hope you realize, but I've made a grave sacrifice for you tonight. The book that we are reading from is one we haven't opened for quite some time. Every time I would say the title of this book, my great grand collector's clock would chime 12 times. And I'll admit, it kinda bugged me. But I feel like it's time to take a break from goosebumps and tales from the crypt and bring you a terrifying tale from Still More Tales for the Midnight Hour. Still More Tales for the Midnight Hour. Well, that's strange. Normally I would say midnight, and tonight's tale of terror is from Still More Tales for the Midnight Hour. I honestly don't know what's going on. Still More Tales for the Midnight Hour is written by J.B. Stamper. It was first published in 1989 by Scholastic and contains 13 stories of horror to keep you checking your closet all night long. And tonight's little tale is called The Wax Museum. Shall we begin? There's nothing to be scared of, the oldest boy in class said in a bragging voice. The people are just made of wax, like candles. Still, the group of boys had slowed down to a shuffling pace, stepping on each other's heels and unconsciously herding together for safety. They were walking through the dimly lit entrance to the Wax Museum. Mr. Archer, their history teacher, was busy back at the admissions desk paying for their tickets. I hear this place has all the murderers in history, young boy said nervously. Hitler even. Hitler, great. My video's definitely getting flagged for this. An uneasy giggle swept over the group. They had all heard stories about Hitler. What would he look like? Mr. Archer had said the wax figures seemed so real that you sometimes forgot they were wax. Just as the boys came to a wooden door at the end of the hallway, Mr. Archer hurried up from behind them. All right, boys, he said in his deep official voice, we're ready to begin our tour. The museum director has agreed to let me take you around, since I've been here so often, nerd. Now, everyone pair up and stand in a straight line. There were a few minutes of pushing and shoving as the boys found partners and lined up. Mr. Archer looked over the group and noticed that, as usual, Andrew and Robbie had paired up together. He would have to watch them, but perhaps they would be good today, for once. Come along then, Mr. Archer said importantly, opening the door in front of them to reveal a long, narrow room. An aisle ran down the center of the room, and on both sides were displays of people in historical costumes. The boys slowly filed in, their faces lit with amazement. They look so alive. It's creepy, a young boy said. Oh, there's Julius Caesar being stabbed by Brutus and his friends, one said, pointing his finger at a group of men in Roman togas. Ooh, look at the blood, another boy said. It still looks wet. Mr. Archer chuckled as the boys broke out of line and scrambled up to see the exhibits. Then he saw Andrew and Robbie standing together by the door, whispering to each other. Boys, come in the room, he said impatiently. Andrew and Robbie stopped whispering and obediently walked up to the first exhibit. They stared down at Julius Caesar's body, which was covered with knife wounds. Caesar's eyes were staring up at his murderers, and his face was twisted in the agony of death. This gives me the creeps, Robbie said. Not me. I think it's great, Andrew said. It's like all these dead people have come alive again. You're weird, Robbie said. So is the museum, Andrew answered. I wonder what we could do to add a little more excitement to this place. Both boys turned to look at Mr. Archer, who was watching them with distrustful eyes. Why don't we just look at the exhibits, Robbie said, turning away from Caesar's bloody body. I don't want to get into any trouble here. Robbie stopped in front of another group of wax figures. In the center was Henry VIII, standing with his hands on his hips and his eyes staring straight ahead. Behind the king stood the wax figure of an executioner, holding a double-edged axe in his hands. On the ground below him was the wax figure of Anne Boleyn, one of Henry VIII's wives. She was waiting to have her head chopped off at the orders of her husband, the king. "Look at that ring on Henry's finger," Andrew whispered. "What a great souvenir it would be." "Andrew," Robbie said in a scared whisper. "Don't!" But Andrew didn't pay any attention to him. He checked to see if Mr. Archer and the other boys were looking. Most of them had walked farther on down the aisle of exhibits. Andrew reached his hand out toward the king's left hand. He touched the cold wax of the fingers. Then he put his fingers around the ring and tugged at it. It slipped down a bit, but got stuck over the finger's waxy knuckle. "Andrew! Robbie!" Mr. Archer's voice called from down the aisle. "Don't lag behind. Come along." Andrew quickly pulled his hand away from the ring. He glanced up at the wax image of King Henry's face before leaving. The hard eyes were staring straight at him. They even seemed to follow him as he walked away. "This place might be getting to me," Andrew said to Robbie. "I thought old Henry looked a little angry." "You're going to get us into trouble," Robbie mumbled. Andrew looked at him with a sneer. "You're turning out to be some coward, Robbie. Maybe I should get a new friend." Robbie shook his head so hard that his glasses almost fell off. Andrew was his only friend. The two boys walked down the aisle to catch up with Mr. Archer and the rest of the class. "Who knows the name of this great man?" Mr. Archer asked as he pointed toward a short man in a military uniform, standing in front of a map of Europe. The man had a scowl on his face, and one hand pushed inside his jacket front. "Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France," said the smartest boy in the class. Oh, another nerd. "That's correct," Mr. Archer said, beaming at the boy. "This is Napoleon, the great conqueror of Europe, who was finally defeated at Waterloo. Now, if you'll move along, we'll visit the more modern exhibits in the room." The class followed Mr. Archer through a set of heavy velvet curtains into the next room. Robbie started off after them, but Andrew pulled him back. "Look what I just found," Andrew said, opening his hand to show Robbie something. Robbie peered down at the shiny piece of metal on his outstretched palm. "It's a pin. Where did you get it?" "I found it on the floor at home, just before I came here. I thought—" "No," Robbie said. "You can't do that. We'd be arrested." "Calm down," Andrew said. "Nobody will ever know. I just want to find out if these things are really made of wax." Andrew picked up the pin and leaned his long arm over the railing in front of the exhibit of Napoleon. He could just reach the Emperor's left shoulder. With a quick jab, he pushed the pin through the costume and into the wax. Robbie let out a short scream. "Be quiet! What's the matter with you?" Andrew said, quickly pulling out the pin. "Napoleon moved! I saw him move!" Robbie stammered. "When you stuck that pin in, his face moved like it hurt." Andrew looked at Robbie in disgust. "I can't believe you are such a coward. Look, you can see the wax on the pin. These people may look real, but they're just wax." Robbie saw the coating of white wax on the pin. Then he looked again at Napoleon's face and ran down off the aisle to join Mr. Archer. Andrew trailed behind, hiding the pin in his pocket. Mr. Archer was standing in a large round room that had exhibits all around its edges. He was telling the class a story. Robbie and Andrew just heard the end, and still today we think of him as the monster of the 20th century. "Hitler," Robbie said, and pointed to the man with a short moustache in a brown Nazi uniform. "Nazi, great, there's another flag." "All right, boys," Mr. Archer said. "There are many more interesting exhibits in this room. You can look around and ask me any questions you like." He paused and looked at his watch. "But in half an hour, we'll be boarding the bus. I promised that I'd have you back in the school parking lot at 3:15. "I don't have to be back," Andrew whispered to Robbie. "My parents are both away on vacation, and I'm staying at home alone." "You're lucky your parents trust you," Robbie said. "Especially since they shouldn't," Andrew added. "Let's take a closer look at Hitler." The rest of the class was looking at different figures in the modern history room. Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Mahatma Gandhi, and others. Andrew and Robbie stood alone in front of the exhibit of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi officers. Even his moustache looks real, Robbie said, staring at Hitler's short, dark moustache. I wonder if it's made of real hair, Andrew said. Turn around, Robbie, and keep an eye on everyone else. Tell me when they're not looking. What are you going to do? Robbie asked in a worried voice. Just be quiet and tell me when nobody is looking, Andrew insisted. Robbie watched nervously for a few minutes. Finally, the moment came when everyone else's back was turned on them. Now, he whispered. Robbie turned around just as Andrew reached his hand out to Hitler's face and pulled out the hair of his moustache. It won't come loose, Andrew hissed under his breath. He gave another hard tug. Robbie screamed as Andrew's hand came back holding a small tuft of hair. Everyone in the room turned to stare at them. What's going on, boys? Mr. Archer asked, hurrying over. Nothing, sir, Andrew said, hiding his hand behind his back. I thought I saw Hitler's hand move, Robbie stammered. He has a wild imagination, Andrew broke in to say. Mr. Archer looked from Robbie to Andrew to the wax figure of Hitler. Don't be ridiculous, Robbie. That is just a wax figure. Then he walked away, shaking his head. His hand did move, Andrew, Robbie whispered in a scared voice. Just when you pulled part of the moustache out, he started to hit you. Sure, Robbie. Sure, Andrew said, ignoring his friend. How do you like my souvenir? He displayed the tuft of hair in his outstretched hand. I just wish I had that ring on Henry VIII's finger. Suddenly, Andrew's face lit up with a smile. I know what I'll do. And you've got to help me, Robbie. No, Andrew, forget it, Robbie said. Come on, all you have to do is tell Mr. Archer that I went home early because I felt sick. My parents aren't home to miss me, and I can spend the night in the museum. What? Robbie said. I'm going to spend the night here. Think of all the things I could do with nobody around watching me. Andrew glanced quickly around the room. Then he walked over to a wall that was covered by long, heavy, velvet curtains. He pulled the curtains aside and looked behind them. There's enough room for me to hide here, he whispered. All you have to do is cover for me. You decide right now whether or not you're going to be my friend. Okay, Robbie said. Okay. Andrew took a quick look around the room and then slipped behind the curtains. Robbie walked away to join Mr. Archer and tell him the lie. Andrew woke up with a sudden start. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. Then he remembered. The Wax Museum. He was hiding behind the curtains in the Wax Museum. He must have fallen asleep earlier in the night because the air was so hot and musty. He pulled back the curtains to peer out. The museum was empty and closed. Only a few security lights shone on the exhibits. Andrew checked his watch. 2 minutes after midnight. Oh, that's right. He wondered what had woken him at this hour. Just then, he heard a tapping of something against wood. He turned to look at the exhibit where Hitler stood. A feeling of sickening horror swept over him. Hitler was tapping a wooden map pointer against his desk. He was pointing around the room and talking to his officers. Andrew pinched himself hard to make sure he wasn't having a terrible nightmare. Just then, he saw Hitler's dark, beady eyes meet his. Hitler let out a scream and barked orders at his officers. Andrew watched with terror as they all began to move from the exhibit and climb over the railing into the room. Andrew scrambled to his feet and ran for the exit. He glanced back to see Hitler's angry face sneering at him. There was a red mark on his white face where Andrew had pulled off part of his moustache. Andrew raced down the narrow hallway, through the other exhibits. His heart was pounding wildly, and his brain was slowly turning panicky. He fumbled in his pocket for the tuft of hair that he had pulled from Hitler's face. When he found it, he threw the hair on the floor and stumbled on. The pounding of the German's feet was loud behind him, but Andrew gained distance on them as he turned a corner in the aisle. Then, in front of him, he saw Napoleon. The Emperor slowly drew his hand out of his jacket and reached for his sword. Andrew's stomach turned inside him as Napoleon pulled the sword from his sheath and leaped over the railing. Andrew remembered the pin he had stuck in the wax figure, only the figure wasn't wax anymore. Napoleon was alive and breathing heavily, only a few feet behind him. Andrew could hear the swish of the sword in the air and feel the cool breeze it made on his neck. In a wild panic, Andrew sped forward down the hallway. He knew that soon he would reach the entrance door to the museum. Perhaps a night guard would be there. Perhaps he could jump through a window to safety. Perhaps this nightmare would end if he could only escape through that wooden door. Then ahead of him, he saw a huge figure step from the shadows. It was Henry VIII. He stood in the middle of the hallway, barring Andrew's path. With a cruel smile on his face, the king pointed a finger at Andrew. The next morning, Robbie led Mr. Archer and the guard into the museum. Robbie hadn't been able to sleep all night, worrying about Andrew. Finally, he had called Mr. Archer and told him what Andrew had done. The guard flicked on all the lights around the exhibits. Robbie started to rush toward the room at the end of the museum where Andrew had hidden. But when he passed the exhibit with Henry VIII, he saw something that made him stop and scream. Anne Boleyn was no longer the figure kneeling beneath the executioner's axe. Andrew knelt there instead, his face set in a strange expression of terror, and when Robbie reached out to touch him, he felt only the hard, cold smoothness of wax. Amazing. Now, I'm going to skip over my devilishly delicious puns and go straight into a little history lesson for you all. Anne Boleyn's story is a very interesting one. A commoner, she captured the attention of Henry VIII, who stopped at nothing to make her his wife. I won't spoil the ending for you, but she was the first Queen of England to lose her head over her royal king. Go and do some research. Got it? Good. Thanks again for joining me as we reached into Still More Tales for the midnight hour. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and ring the little bell icon to be notified of our next little Fable Fright. And you can also follow me, you weirdos, on Instagram at Old Pal Collector. And now, as always, good night out there, whatever you are.